me introduce you to three really stupid people.
Today, the cost of solar and wind energy is 9 times
cheaper
than imported fossil fuels.
I'll say it again.
Clean British power is cheaper than imported fossil fuels.
Offshore wind is now the cheapest form of electricity in this country.
It is cheaper to save the planet than it is to destroy it.
Those people are either stupid or liars, or probably both. But the only way now I can see of actually saving the madness we're going into in the UK is to actually support the Reform Party. And that's what I'll be doing, is supporting the Reform Party as the only way. And I'll start off this video because I'm going to dissect this in some detail, because there's a lot of confusion going on about the prices paid for renewable energy. And I want to uncover the deceit, a deceit that even fooled the people who were part of making it. So you'll understand it when you see the video. But let's start off with Richard Tice, the Deputy Leader of Reform, actually asking a question of Ed Milliband, and he's the leader of the energy policy. He's the man in charge of British energy, if you like, in the UK Parliament, about actually getting rid of this total lie that renewables are cheaper.
Will the Secretary of State actually, who's obsessed with renewable energy, be honest with the British people? Because the truth is that the offshore wind turbines bid today are some 20% above current prices. The floating offshore wind is some 3 times the current prices. His own department, Madam Deputy Speaker, say that actually this requires subsidies of some £1.5 billion a year. That's before the extra transmission costs, before the constraint payments, before the compensation payments for blighting the countryside of my constituents, and before the cost of backup when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. So why would the Secretary of State be honest and tell the truth that renewable energy is more expensive, not cheaper?
Secretary of State.
I have to say that I'm interested in the honourable gentleman's intervention, because his manifesto is basically for higher bills and to make people poorer. And you don't need to look into the crystal ball. You just need to look at the record, because the truth is that the cost of living crisis, the energy bills crisis, casts a long shadow in this country. And the energy bills crisis was not caused by our dependence on renewables. It was caused by our exposure to fossil fuels. And he just needs to understand this very basic point, which is that whether fossil fuels are produced in this country or internationally, they are sold on the international market. And that's why the British people paid the price and government forked out £94 billion. And the only way to get off the roller coaster of international gas markets and take back control is to become a clean energy superpower.
Well, please note this. Going back 5 years, 2018 to say 2023, and looking at the costs had we not had wind, and with wind, we come up with an £18 billion saving by just having gas. That's a fact. Now, one time during those 5 years, with the Ukraine crisis, wind energy was much cheaper than gas. Fact. But even that peak there doesn't get compensated for by the continuing subsidy going on. And as Richard Tice just pointed out, there are a lot more costs associated with the wind than they're letting on about. And one of the biggest is this. As we add this new lot of wind power, we're going to be paying much more when called constraint payments. Now, overnight, we maybe use, say, 25 gigawatts at that rate, and we're actually increasing wind up to about 90. So when it's windy overnight, we've got to pay, we only need, say, 25, and we've got to pay for maybe 80 or 90 even. That means we're going to be paying 3 or 4 times the price. And so constraint payments are going to just rocket. And as new wind farms are added, they're going to be paid more and more, all of them, to switch off. This is an enormous cost. But that is not it alone. We're having to pay £60 billion, that's £12 billion a year over the next 5 years, to put a whole pile of pylons all over the UK. That's according to the National Grid. And also, we're having to pay maybe 500 billion, the estimate, but it's nowhere near that, it's much more, to rip up all the roads, replace all the substations, and get all the networks to your homes. I mean, this is madness on a grand scale. So the facts are that wind power and solar, but wind power looking at here, is so much more expensive. Now, there are some little cheating things that go on here. So first of all, let's look at what they call the strike price, because it's not what it seems. Now, strike prices, which is what you see publicised everywhere, is not the price we pay for the wind. It's much higher, because under the contracts, projects agree to generate electricity for a strike price that is fixed on the real terms, meaning it is index linked to inflation, and that is the Consumer Price Index. The results are usually reported in 2012 prices. So what you're seeing with strike prices is not today, not what we pay, it's the 2012 price. And here is the government list. This is the top of a long list of the recent awards a few days ago to the entire wind industry when we spent the £1.5 billion. Well, we just saved that from the pensioners, so that's okay. We spent the £1.5 billion on doing this. And there we are. It's 2012 prices. So how do we get to the current price of what we actually pay? Well, we have to allow for the Consumer Price Index inflation. Now, going to the Bank of England, they have a Consumer Price Index calculator. So you can put in the year, 2012, you can put in the latest date that they've got inflation for, July 24. So the figure will be a bit higher than that, of course. It increases every month, the actual difference. So I put in £10 and I get back £13.93. So that's a 39.3% increase. So we have to increase all the prices, the strike prices, by 39.3% to get the actual price. So this simple bar chart shows you the strike prices that have just been used in the current round. And just look at the darker bar. They're the higher bars. They're the recent ones we're paying. So the strike price for floating offshore there is £176. But you've got to apply the 39.3% inflation, and that turns it into £242. And I've been quoting £246 because I had to guess ahead of time in my previous videos, so it now stands to be corrected. But if you allow for the extra month of August and September, it will be the £246. Then for onshore wind, which they're quoting £73, that becomes £102, which is the figure I've been quoting in the run-up to this auction. So it is a very different figure to what you're being told. It is so confusing, this, that in the Labour manifesto, Ed Milliband, who did the section on this, actually got confused, and they used the old 2012 prices for their calculations and got it all wrong. And I did a video on this, and the video link for that is in the description below this video. So even the very people who trade in this, who use it in the department, and then Labour go and do a manifesto for the election, based on what? Based on wrong figures. You couldn't make this up, the incompetence. But to say that this is cheaper than gas is absurd, especially when we could have our own frack gas and have prices maybe down to £30 a megawatt hour. Just look at what we're talking about here. And by the way, Ed Milliband has shoved £1.5 billion into floating offshore wind, and that is the exact amount that's been taken from the pensioners. You couldn't make this up. But we also need to just take a look at those previous strike prices, the ones applicable before this auction. And look at them here. They're in the red bars. Now, what is the price increase that we've had? So this is on top of any inflation. This is relative one to the other. And we've had enormous price hikes in renewables. Just look at them. And these are the percentages above those bars that the prices have increased by. Now the previous auction round actually produced 0 takers. Nobody wanted them at the prices offered. And the reason was that and I've been into this in detail in another video, that the Department of Energy assumed a much higher load factor for the wind turbines. So instead of like 27% and so on, which is what they were getting from the wind farms, they actually told them they're going to get 45%. So they based the costs on that, and no one would take up the offer until they increased, in the case of wind, until they increased it by the 66% you can see there for offshore wind. And then they started to get takers. They had takers. But that is just the same as taking the 45% load factor and reducing it back to what they actually got, about 27%. So they became the laughingstock of the wind farm industry then, and they still are to this day. So look at those price hikes. That's in relative terms. Now, if you actually change all those strike prices to real prices, you begin to get an idea of the inflationary factor in the wind farm industry. And the truth is that after about 15 years, most wind farms, especially the higher rating ones above 2 megawatt turbines, actually are not worth keeping. And there's a huge scam going on here that needs exposing, because you, the taxpayer, is going to be left with a bill at the end of this. Now, there is also a problem with the older wind farms. Because of this huge maintenance costs, they're really not viable. They have to start shutting down. And so there's a bit of a cheat gone on here. The new round has allowed the old wind turbines, who already have agreed inflation-linked prices, to increase 25% of their capacity to the new prices. So in other words, a fudge is going on, hiding this maintenance problem, hiding the problem of the limited life of wind farms. Really, after 15 years, they've pretty well had it. In my previous video, links underneath this one, I've explained why. And the work of Professor Hughes from Edinburgh University exposes all this. So having shown you the astronomical prices facing you, all index linked, all contracted for at least 15 years ahead, what about the cost of the alternative gas? So let me take a more in-depth look at that, because I've been quoting 60 to 65 pounds per megawatt hour. Let's look at it. Now, as a reference point, looking at the price of natural gas in the UK here, you can see that the spot price here at the moment is 86.95 pence per therm. And that went up to here, 800, around about 10 times today's price. Well, that's what it was as a peak, which the alarmists have taken to be, cheaper than time. And that is a total distortion of the truth. You only have to look at this graph again when we had that peak, and that is a total distortion of the truth, but that's what they do. Now, at that price, this works out to actually the gas price for supply of gas to the gas station is around about £30 per megawatt hour. Typically, a gas station in Britain would give a 50% capacity factor. So with £30 per megawatt hour going in, when it's converted to electric, it's around about £60 a megawatt hour coming out. But of course, if you're just taking the gas through the gas system directly, then that's cheaper. So no matter how you cut the cake, gas is cheaper. But even the gas price, that's the gas produced electricity, is inflated. It's inflated because the gas stations have to stand in standby to all the wind. They're up and down like a yo-yo. And yet, and by the way, they have to keep gas being wasted to be ready to go up and down. And they lose about 50% of their efficiency by lowering them and being a backup to wind. So even that's inflated. If we were fracking, and if we didn't have this mad net zero nonsense, we'd have energy prices probably a third, maybe even a quarter of what we have today. A bit like America has now. And that's what we should be doing. But the only party, the only political party, and the only way out of this total mess is reform. They've got the right policies on energy. And so for the first time, I'm saying vote reform. And I have to back that completely as the only sensible solution to this madness. Now, I know net zero cannot work into the future. I know that because the costs are just so ginormous. And don't forget, those costs you've just seen are only part of the cost. As Mr. Tice pointed out in that comment, in that question in the House of Commons, there's lots of extra other costs. But one of the biggest coming is the fact that as we increase wind, less and less of it will be actually used. In other words, we'll be paying for more and more of it just to sit still doing nothing, because we can't use it overnight. And there's no other way of storing it. There's no solution other than the solution of gas to back up wind. And the new gas turbines, we've just built a big one in the UK, are 65% efficient, not the 50% of the older ones. So we really, really should stop this net zero nonsense. And the only way out of it is to vote reform. And therefore, I've got to say that because there's no choice anymore. The parties are now, the only parties that are viable now are reform. The Greens, obviously, they're gone. The Liberal Democrats, what they mean, but they're gone. The Conservative are just the same. There's a smidgen of a difference between Labour and Conservatives. They prevaricate about just delaying it a bit, but they're sold on the net zero nonsense. And of course, as you know, the whole basis of net zero and the idea that CO2 controls the atmosphere is absolute nonsense. So there we are. I hope you've enjoyed the video. And I hope you understand why I've had to come out now politically, because there is no choice anymore. The only viable real-world way of doing this with this government, as it starts to fall apart, because all the policies they're doing are absurd, and it's going to fail, but as they fall apart, is to get in with reform and get it in this May, when the county council elections come, when those local elections come, get reform people in. Stop all this nonsense. We've got council after council in the UK declaring a climate emergency. When you ask them what the climate emergency is, they can't even define it. This is how stupid the world is. Stop this nonsense. Let's get back to common sense politics, and let's vote reform. This madness of Ed Milliband is going to drag down the entire economy, because when the cost of energy goes up, as they put it up hugely, the cost of everything goes up. Everything you buy in the shop depends on cheap energy. The entire economy depends on cheap energy. This man, Ed Milliband, is probably one of the most dangerous people we could ever have in government. He is advocating a system, for example, where now the UK car industry is having to ration petrol and diesel cars, because for each one they sell over the ratio to electric cars, they get fined £15,000 per car. And their ratio is increasing as 22% this year, and it's increasing up to 80% over the next few years. This is a Soviet-style supply chain system controlled by government. So now what car you buy is under the control of people like Ed Milliband. I will leave you with a President Reagan joke about the Soviet Union that does remind me of exactly what we are heading for here.
I've been collecting stories that are told in the Soviet Union by their people among themselves, which reveal they've got a great sense of humor, but they've also got a pretty cynical attitude toward their system. And I told this one, Bill, you'll have to hear it again. I told it in the car. I didn't tell this one to Gorbachev. You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union own automobiles. There's a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. And this happened to a fellow, and this is their story that they tell, this joke, that this man, he laid down his money, and then the fellow that was in charge said to him, okay, come back in 10 years and get your car. And he said, morning or afternoon? And the fellow behind the counter said, well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make? And he said, well, the plumber's coming in the morning.